The HOA thought they could control me with a $500 fishing fine. What they didn't know was I had the money, the will, and the fury to buy the very lake they were protecting. And when I did, I put up one simple sign: residents not welcome. Had only been back from deployment for 3 weeks. 3 long weeks of adjusting to civilian life, learning how to sleep without boots on, and reminding myself that I didn't have to keep one eye open through the night. My new property was supposed to be the answer to all that, the peaceful reset I desperately needed. I had bought a small house at the edge of a quiet lake in a rural HOA-governed community in the south. It wasn't fancy, but it had space, fresh air, and a beautiful stretch of water right in view of my back porch. It was exactly what I wanted: calm, quiet, and mind. My younger brother, Jake, had come out to visit me that Saturday. He was still in college, still full of jokes and stories, and he showed up with a cooler full of drinks and 2 fishing poles. We hadn't fished together since we were kids, with old tangled lines and peanut butter sandwiches in our pockets. This time, we were men. Tired, sunburned, and ready to relax, but men nonetheless. We set up just at the edge of my property, the cooler between us, lines in the water, and the morning sun warming our shoulders. The lake was still peaceful. We didn't talk much at first. We didn't need to. It must have been no more than 30 minutes into our peaceful silence when we heard the electric hum of a golf cart speeding down the gravel path. I turned and saw a woman in a sun hat and oversized sunglasses, more like something you'd see on a red carpet than on a trail. She had a clipboard, and as she rolled to a stop beside us, I already knew this wasn't a friendly visit. "Excuse me," she barked, not even bothering with a good morning. "This is HOA property. Fishing is not allowed without board approval and a paid permit." Jake and I exchanged a glance. I stood up, brushing grass from my jeans. "Ma'am, we're on my property line. Just relaxing. Not making noise or bothering anyone. That lake is under HOA jurisdiction," she snapped, "and I can see both your lines are in it. That's a violation." I had heard stories about HOA boards being strict, but this was something else. The woman didn't ask questions. She didn't introduce herself. She simply flipped her clipboard around, scribbled something down, and tore off a pink slip. Violation 8.3a, unauthorized use of common water amenities. A $500 fine is now issued. If unpaid within 10 business days, additional penalties will apply. She handed me the slip like a parking ticket, then tapped her foot impatiently as I read it. Jake let out a chuckle, clearly thinking this had to be a joke, but her face was stone cold. No smile, no sense of humor, just control. I was stunned. I had just come home from overseas, risked my life, worn the uniform, and fought in the dust and heat, and now I was being fined for fishing at a lake beside my own property. I felt my blood pressure spike, but I didn't yell. I didn't cuss her out. I simply folded the pink slip and said, "Thanks. You can leave now." Jake and I packed up quietly after she left. The mood was broken. That sense of peace was shattered. What had started as a perfect day ended with a sour taste in my mouth and a growing fire in my chest. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I started researching. I wanted to know exactly who had authority over the lake, who owned it, who gave the HOA power to fine people. After a few hours of digging through property maps, public records, and the HOA's own charter, I found something strange. The HOA didn't own the lake. In fact, no one in the neighborhood did. The land and water were still registered to an older couple who lived several counties away, a Mr. and Mrs. Kellerman. They had moved out of state years ago but never sold the lake property. Instead, they had a handshake agreement with the HOA to manage the space and keep it clean. It wasn't legal ownership. It was casual, informal. That changed everything. I reached out to the Kellermans the next morning. I introduced myself politely, explained my situation, and asked them flat out if they'd be willing to sell. To my surprise, they were open to it. Turns out, they were tired of dealing with the HOA too. Over the years, they'd gotten letters, requests, even complaints about lake upkeep, despite not living anywhere nearby. They told me, if someone wants to buy it and take the headache off our hands, we're all for it. A few calls to my lawyer later, and we started the paperwork. It was real. I was going to buy the lake, but I didn't tell anyone yet. Not the HOA, not even Jake. I wanted it done quietly. I wanted to play it calm and cool while the woman with the clipboard thought she'd taught me a lesson. She thought I was just another new guy who would pay the fine and sit quietly next time. She had no idea she'd lit a fuse. While the documents were in progress, I walked the edges of the lake every morning. I studied the lines, the paths, where people fished, and where kids swam. The HOA had even placed benches and signs around it. Community amenity, enjoy respectfully. It made me laugh. They were using someone else's land and pretending it was theirs. No one had bothered to check. By the end of the 3rd week, the deed was mine, official filed, and notarized. I didn't throw a party. I didn't post online. I simply printed out a new sign, bolted it to a wooden post, and planted it deep into the earth right beside the lake's most popular fishing spot. It read in bold red letters, "Private property, nitrogen monoxide, trespassing residents, not welcome trespassers." Will be PROSCCU2 within hours. My phone started ringing. Neighbors, confused residents, HOA board members, but I didn't answer, not yet. I just sat on my porch with a cold drink, watching from a distance as people approached the sign, read it, and turned around in disbelief. Some ignored it, of course. A few brave or foolish souls tried to fish anyway. That's when I brought in my friend Terry, a retired cop and current private security guard. I hired him to patrol the shoreline once a day and call in real police reports for trespassers. Everything done legally, by the book. The HOA had been using fear and authority for years, but now they were dealing with someone who understood rules better than they did, and who had the resources to fight back. The $500 fine they handed me wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a match, and they'd just thrown it onto a pile of dry kindling. I didn't want revenge, I wanted respect. And if it took owning the lake to get it, then so be it. This wasn't about fishing anymore. This was about freedom, dignity, standing up against people who thought power gave them permission to push others around. And I wasn't done yet. The morning after I installed the sign, I woke up early, partly out of habit, partly out of anticipation. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't go unnoticed. The lake had always been the centerpiece of the neighborhood. Morning joggers, dog walkers, and early bird fishermen were regulars. It wasn't long before I heard the distant crunch of gravel under sneakers and stroller wheels. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and waited, the first person to notice. The sign was a jogger named Alan. He lived 2 houses down and usually gave me a polite wave during his morning run. This time he stopped in his tracks, squinted at the sign, and then looked toward my porch with a puzzled expression. I raised my mug and nodded. He walked closer, read the words again, then pointed and mouthed, "You did this." I nodded again. He didn't say a word, just shook his head slowly and jogged off, clearly unsure of what to think. Over the next hour, more people showed up, some curious, others furious. By noon, I had watched no fewer than 15 neighbors approach the sign, whisper, or point, then turn back toward their homes with stiff shoulders and confused frowns. Around 2 in the afternoon, the HOA board president herself arrived, Mrs. Linda Carter, the same woman who had handed me the fine with such smug authority. She came stomping up the path in her white blouse and stiff blazer, her signature clipboard in hand. Her golf cart screeched to a stop, and she marched toward the sign like it had personally offended her. I was already halfway down the porch steps before she even spoke. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped, jabbing her pen at the sign, like she might poke it into submission. "It means what it says," I replied coolly. "Private property. Residents not welcome." She glared at me. "This is community land. You can't just put up signs claiming it as yours." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a copy of the property deed. "Actually, I can," and I did. She snatched the paper from my hand and read it quickly, her face going from flushed to ghost pale in under a minute. I almost felt bad for her. "Almost you bought the lake?" she asked, blinking as if she'd misread it. "Yes, ma'am. The whole thing, including the paths and the dock. But this is a community amenity. It's part of the neighborhood experience. It was never part of your property," I interrupted. "The HOA was using it under a gentleman's agreement. No legal claim, no ownership. You just assumed you had the right." Mrs. Carter was stunned silent for a moment, which was probably a first for her. When she finally found her voice again, it was quieter, but no less firm. "You can't just block access to an entire neighborhood. There will be consequences." I raised an eyebrow, like a $500 fine. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her golf cart, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. As she drove away, I could hear her muttering something about lawyers. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. People started confronting me in the street. Some were respectful, asking if there was a way to work something out. Others were rude, shouting about how I was ruining the community. One guy, a loudmouth named Rick, who had always acted like he owned the block, came to my door banging like he was the police. "You can't keep us off that lake," he yelled before I even opened the door. "All the way. We pay dues. We have rights." "You pay dues to the HOA, not to me," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "And your rights end where my property begins." "Man, you're just being a petty jackass," he snapped. "You're welcome to your opinion," I said with a shrug. "But if I catch you on my land again, I'll have you ticketed or arrested." He cussed under his breath and stormed off, but I wasn't bothered. The law was on my side, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled. They tried to smooth things over with residents, but every time someone asked why they had allowed a privately owned lake to be treated like a community feature, the board had no good answer. A few angry residents even began demanding that dues be reduced, arguing they were no longer receiving full value. Some even threatened to sue the HOA itself for misrepresentation. It was chaos. The best part, I hadn't lifted a finger beyond posting that sign and showing the deed. Everything else was just the result of years of arrogance finally meeting a hard wall of reality. Still, I wasn't trying to be a villain. Truthfully, I didn't want to punish everyone in the neighborhood. I knew some of them were decent folks. who hadn't asked for any of this. So I started making a mental list of who had treated me with respect and who hadn't. People like Alan, the quiet jogger, and Mrs. Grayson, the elderly woman who always smiled and offered me sweet tea when I passed her porch. Those folks weren't the problem. It was the board members and their followers who had enforced the rules like they were running a military base. A week after the sign went up, I held a meeting, not a public one, but a small private gathering with a few neighbors I trusted. I explained the situation, showed them the paperwork, and let them ask questions. Most were just curious about why I'd done it. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I told them honestly. But I moved here for peace, not to be bullied. That fine wasn't about fishing, it was about control. And I don't do well with people trying to control me. They nodded. Some apologized on behalf of the HOA. Others thanked me for standing up for myself. I told them that while the lake was private now, I wasn't opposed to letting respectful neighbors use it on my terms. I made it clear that if the HOA backed off and quit trying to bully people, I'd consider offering access passes to folks I trusted. But until that day came, the sign stayed up. The next weekend, the neighborhood kids who usually played by the water were nowhere to be seen. A few parents glared at me as I passed by. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The HOA posted a notice on the community board saying they were exploring legal options and committed to preserving resident access to neighborhood amenities. I laughed when I read it. They still didn't get it. A few more board members resigned in the following weeks. Rumors flew. Some said lawsuits were being drafted. Others said the HOA president was under pressure to step down. Meanwhile, I kept to myself, fished alone, walked the shoreline, maintained the lake better than the HOA ever had. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about proving a point. You can't bully everyone forever. Sooner or later you push the wrong guy, and when you do, don't be surprised if he pushes back harder. The HOA learned that the hard way, and I wasn't done with them yet. The HOA boardroom was a place I'd never entered and never intended to. But after I bought the lake and planted that now infamous sign, it became the hotbed of conflict. I heard whispers from neighbors about emergency meetings, angry emails, and finger-pointing behind closed doors. Everyone wanted someone to blame, and it was clear the board had no idea how to handle being on the receiving end of outrage for once. About a week after Mrs. Carter stormed away from my porch with a property deed in her hand, a newsletter hit every mailbox in the neighborhood. It was written in classic HOA speak, vague language, passive tone, and an unshakable air of superiority. The header read, "Recent changes regarding lake access." It went on to explain that due to unforeseen developments, the HOA no longer maintained authority over the lake and that residents should temporarily refrain from using lake-adjacent paths and docks until the situation is resolved. In other words, they had been caught with their pants down and were hoping to sweep it under the rug. But the community didn't take it lightly. Dozens of people had moved here for that lake. Realtors advertised it as a major perk. It was in the brochures, the online listings, even the laminated welcome packets. Families had built memories on those waters. And now, suddenly, they were being told it was off limits because someone else legally owned it, and that someone happened to be the quiet guy on the edge of the neighborhood who'd just been fined for fishing. You could feel the tension in the air. Mrs. Grayson, my elderly neighbor, came by that afternoon holding the newsletter in one hand and a plate of lemon bars in the other. "They're panicking," she said as she handed me the plate. "You should have heard them at the meeting last night. Everyone's yelling about false advertising and wasted dues." Linda Carter looked like she was about to pop. I chuckled. "You ever seen her admit she was wrong?" Mrs. Grayson laughed. "That woman would rather chew glass." I thanked her and watched her stroll away, wondering just how deep the panic was going inside that boardroom. Turns out, it was worse than I imagined. Later that week, I got an anonymous email through the contact form on my website. I ran a site, Business for Tactical Outdoor Gear. The message read, "They're trying to find a way to take back the lake. Watch your back." Not everyone's happy about how things turned out. A friend was no name, no address, just a warning. At first I brushed it off. Sounded like some paranoid neighbor. But the next morning when I went to check the lake perimeter, I noticed something strange. One of my new private property signs had been torn down, yanked right off its post and tossed into the water. Petty vandalism. Maybe, but it sent a message. I reviewed the security footage from the motion camera I'd installed facing the trail. Around 1:47 a.m., a dark figure in a hoodie had walked up, used something, probably a crowbar, and yanked the sign loose. The video wasn't clear enough for a face, but the height and build looked familiar. Jake watched the clip with me. "That's Rick," he said without hesitation. "Has to be. That loudmouth's been mad since you bought the lake. He's the only one dumb enough to think this would scare you," I agreed. I didn't have hard proof, but Rick had been the most vocal critic since the day my sign went up. He even started going door to door trying to rally people to push me into selling it back. I'd ignored him so far, but this was a different game now. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. But I did go to my lawyer. I had him send an official cease and desist letter to the HOA and to Rick's address. It outlined the trespassing, the vandalism, and reminded them of my property rights. It wasn't aggressive, just firm, legal, clean, but it was a shot across the bow, and I knew it would make waves. Sure enough, it did. 2 days later, Mrs. Carter herself showed up at my gate again, but this time, she didn't come storming. She came quietly, nervously, no clipboard, no entourage. Just her and a forced smile. "I was hoping we could talk," she said, standing awkwardly at the gate. I walked out to meet her. "Talk about what?" "Look," she began. "Things got a little heated, and I think we may have all acted a bit rashly. This community is built on cooperation. We value being good neighbors." I kept my arms crossed. Was finding me for fishing considered good neighbor behavior? She flinched a little. "I'll admit that may have been an overreach." I waited. "We were hoping to propose a compromise," she continued. "Maybe you could lease part of the lake back to the community. Set some basic rules and we'd compensate you monthly. You'd keep ownership, but we'd regain access." "And who enforces these rules?" I asked you. She swallowed hard. "It wouldn't be like before. No offense, but I don't trust your board. You treated me like a criminal over a fishing pole." She didn't argue. "I'll think about it," I said finally, just to end the conversation. She left without pushing. She knew the power dynamic had flipped. She was trying to soften me up, but I didn't feel soft. I felt justified. That weekend, things got even messier. The HOA held an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse. I didn't attend. I wasn't part of the HOA and had no interest in sitting through hours of their chaos, but several neighbors filled me in. Apparently, Linda Carter had to defend herself against a growing mob of angry residents. Some accused her of overreach. Others demanded she step down. One man, an ex-lawyer named Harris, stood up and read a prepared statement accusing the board of negligence and misinformation. And then the bombshell. Someone had pulled up archived marketing material from 3 years ago, brochures, flyers, and website screenshots, all listing the lake as a private community amenity. In other words, false advertising. A handful of residents were now seriously talking about legal action against the HOA for misrepresenting property features and real estate transactions. Linda was cornered. She tried to spin it, saying the lake had always been considered a community asset and that she never expected someone would actually buy it. That's when the shouting started, and the meeting ended in chaos. By Monday, the HOA board had 2 official resignations. Linda Carter remained, but her power had weakened. The board was fractured, the community was outraged, and I, just a quiet guy with a fishing pole, was suddenly at the center of it all. Jake stayed with me for a few nights after that. We laughed about the irony of it all, how a $500 ticket had turned into a total collapse of power in the neighborhood. "I think you accidentally started a revolution," he joked. "Maybe," I replied, "but it was never about revenge. It was about respect." He nodded. "Well, they're definitely respecting you now." And it was true. Neighbors I'd never met started waving when they passed. A few even stopped by with baked goods, homemade wine, or quiet apologies. Word had spread about the truth that I wasn't trying to punish everyone, just defend myself from the HOA's abuse. Most folks understood now, but the board, they hadn't learned their lesson yet, and the next move, that was mine to make. By the time the second board member stepped down, the neighborhood felt like it was teetering on the edge of a full-blown mutiny. Lawn signs that once said "Welcome to Lakeside Meadows" were now fading behind overgrown grass, and whispers of lawsuits drifted like wind through the hedges. The lake, once the sparkling gem of the community, had become a symbol of embarrassment and defeat for the HOA, and yet the real storm hadn't even hit. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in a thick cream envelope. I was sipping coffee on the porch when the courier dropped it into my mailbox. Heavy paper, gold-stamped seal. It wasn't the usual HOA junk mail or a neighbor's complaint. It was from a law firm out of town, a name I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly, half expecting some new threat from the board, but instead, it was a formal request for mediation filed on behalf of the Homeowners Association of Lakeside Meadows. I read the entire document carefully in professional language. It explained that the HOA sought to amicably resolve the conflict over lake access and was requesting a formal mediation session between me, their legal representative, and a certified third-party mediator. They were hoping for a mutually beneficial arrangement that would restore community harmony while respecting property ownership. In other words, they were scared. They knew they couldn't win in court, and now they were trying to save face. I called my attorney, Rebecca Enton. She had been guiding me through the process since I bought the lake, and she understood the politics of small-town HOA drama better than anyone I'd ever met. "They're flailing," she said. "After scanning the documents, they want to look like the good guys now, hoping you'll cave and hand over some access just to shut everyone up." "What do you recommend?" I asked. She smiled through the phone. "We show up confident, and we make them sweat." The mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday at the town civic center. It was a neutral location, a bland building with beige walls and echoing hallways. I arrived early with Rebecca, both of us dressed professionally but comfortably. Across the table sat Mrs. Carter, looking unusually subdued in a plain blazer, and a man I assumed was their legal rep, a stiff, balding attorney with a thick binder of documents in front of him. The mediator, a soft-spoken older gentleman named Frank, began with pleasantries and the usual legal disclaimers. Then he gave each side the floor. The HOA's lawyer started. "Mr. Walker, the board acknowledges that you are the legal owner of the lake and the surrounding paths," he began. "However, we believe that continued private enforcement of the property may significantly damage the harmony of the neighborhood. We're prepared to offer a formal lease agreement that allows the HOA regulated access to the lake for its members in exchange for an annual fee and maintenance responsibility." Let Rebecca respond first. Mr. Walker appreciates the recognition of his legal ownership. However, after being fined, harassed, and having his property vandalized by your residents, he has no current intention of placing control back in the hands of the same board that caused this mess. Mrs. Carter stiffened, clearly wanting to object, but the mediator raised a hand. "Let's keep it civil," he said gently. Rebecca continued. "We're open to discussion, but the HOA must acknowledge fault in falsely representing the lake as a public community feature in years past, and any future arrangement will be completely on Mr. Walker's terms." There was a long pause. The lawyer whispered to Mrs. Carter, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Finally he said, "We're not authorized to admit legal liability on behalf of the board." "Then we're done here," I said plainly. I stood. Rebecca followed. I didn't make a scene, didn't slam anything. I just walked out, calmly, like someone who didn't need to beg for respect anymore. 2 days later, the emails started. Dozens of residents reached out to me directly, bypassing the board. Some wanted to apologize. Others wanted to know if they could still fish or walk the path around the lake. A few even offered to help maintain it. One man named Daryl, a father of 2, wrote me a particularly honest message. "Look, I don't like the HOA any more than you do. I moved here for peace in the lake. My kids love fishing. I didn't know they didn't own it. If there's any way we could work something out, I'd be grateful. And I'll keep Carter and her cronies far away." That message stuck with me, so I called Jake over and we walked the lake together that weekend. "You thinking of letting them back in?" he asked as we watched ducks drift across the calm water. "Not them," I said, "but the people who were decent, didn't harass me or treat me like a criminal, maybe." I took the next week to design something I called the Neighbor Access Program. It was simple. Any resident who wanted to use the lake could apply for a personal permit, no HOA involvement, no middlemen. They signed an agreement to respect the property and not bring guests. No loud parties, no trash. Violators lost access immediately. It was private, personal, and completely under my terms. I printed out 30 copies and hand-delivered them to neighbors I trusted, people who had been kind or respectful. Some were surprised, some even hugged me, and within a week, I had 20 applications returned with thank you notes attached. I posted a sign beside the old warning one, "Lake Access Permits, available for approved residents. Inquire at the Blue House on Maple Lane." This time, the reaction from the community was different. There was no vandalism, no late-night sabotage, just quiet acceptance and a slow, awkward shift of power away from the HOA. But Linda Carter wasn't done, not yet. One morning, about 3 weeks after the mediation, I received a certified letter. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was from a legal firm representing 3 residents. Rick included filing a civil complaint against me for denial of promised community amenities, intentional emotional distress, and unjust restriction of common property. I called Rebecca immediately. "They don't have a case," she said confidently after reading the letter. "They're desperate. This is an intimidation tactic meant to make you panic. They're suing me for not letting them use land. I asked exactly it won't hold, but it means they're not finished trying." So we filed a motion to dismiss, and then we went one step further. Rebecca helped me draft a public statement. I printed copies and delivered them to every mailbox in the community, to the residents of Lakeside Meadows. Let me be clear, I have no desire to isolate myself or ruin anyone's enjoyment of this beautiful neighborhood. However, I will not be bullied, manipulated, or harassed by individuals who feel entitled to property they do not own. I bought the lake legally. I maintain it with my own resources. I do not answer to the HOA, to those who have treated me with kindness and respect. My door remains open to those who choose legal threats and personal attacks. Be aware that I will meet you in court, and I will not lose. Martin Walker had hit the neighborhood like a THUNDERCLAP. And it changed everything. The lawsuit was quietly dropped within a week. Linda Carter resigned a month later. The HOA's reputation crushed. And as I stood by the lake that fall, watching the trees turn gold and orange across the water, I smiled to myself, not out of pride, but out of peace, because finally, I had what I came here for, and the HOA could never take it from me again. Autumn came early that year. The trees lining the lake burned gold and rust, their reflections rippling across the surface like a living oil painting. The air carried a slight chill in the morning, the kind that made coffee taste better in silence, feel deeper. I had started every morning the same way on my porch, boots resting on the wooden rail, steaming mug in my hands, and not a single clipboard-toting HOA officer in sight. It had been 4 months since I bought the lake, and everything had changed. The Homeowners Association of Lakeside Meadows no longer had a lake to brag about or to police. More than half of the original board had resigned or been voted out, including Linda Carter herself. She left quietly, slipping out of office with nothing more than a final, bitter newsletter that blamed unreasonable residents and property disputes for her departure. She didn't even bother to name me. I think that was her final attempt to deny the truth she had lost. I hadn't spoken to her since that failed mediation meeting. Honestly, I didn't need to. I already said everything I wanted to say when I put up that sign, and the residents, most had adjusted. The noise had faded. The shouting, the gossip, the tension had all started to fall away. People got tired of fighting, tired of taking sides. The truth had come out, and in time, everyone just settled into the new reality. The neighbor access program had become something of a local legend. It wasn't complicated. If you respected my property and treated me like a person instead of a problem, you were welcome. I didn't need a committee or a vote or some bloated rulebook to decide who got access. I needed common sense and common courtesy. There were a few bumps, of course. One man let his teenage son host a party near the lake after being told explicitly not to buy cans, loud music, the whole mess. I revoked his permit within an hour, and when he came stomping up to my porch the next day, demanding I give it back, I didn't argue. I just handed him a trash bag, pointed toward the mess, and closed the door. He cleaned it up and left quietly. No drama. Most people were respectful, though. The kind you want as neighbors. Folks who understood boundaries. They fished with their kids, walked their dogs by the water, even helped me clean up fallen branches after a storm rolled through. One couple offered to repaint the old dock. Another helped me replant reeds to prevent erosion. For the first time, the lake was being treated with care, not because of HOA rules, but because the people using it had earned the right to, and that's when it really hit me. This wasn't about the lake anymore. It was about control, who had it, and who abused it. For years, the HOA had used power like a weapon, not a responsibility. They built fences, fined people, and micromanaged lives, not to protect the community, but to feed their own sense of authority. But when they lost that lake, they lost their leverage. And when they lost their leverage, the neighborhood finally started breathing again. I was no hero. I didn't save anyone. I just stood my ground and refused to be pushed. And somehow, that simple act rippled through every cul-de-sac and front porch in Lakeside Meadows. A few months after Linda Carter resigned, the remaining board members tried to start fresh. They held open forums, asking residents what they really wanted from the HOA. The meetings were tense at first, but without Linda leading them, the tone was different, more humble, more willing to listen. They rewrote the bylaws, removed half the restrictions that had made daily life miserable, and even allowed residents to vote on landscaping preferences. One change that passed unanimously: the HOA could never again claim or manage land they did not legally own. Imagine that, having to vote on something that should have been common sense. Still, it was progress. I didn't attend the meetings, but neighbors kept me updated. The new board president, a woman named Tasha Wells, actually knocked on my door one Saturday afternoon. She was soft-spoken, kind, and most importantly, respectful. "I just wanted to say thank you," she told me. "You forced this place to grow up." I chuckled. That wasn't the plan. I just wanted to fish. She laughed too. "Sometimes it only takes a ripple to shift the whole lake." That quote stuck with me. It was poetic and true. Jake came to visit often after things settled down. We'd fish at dawn like we used to, quietly, side by side, with nothing but the click of the reel and the calls of distant birds between us. One morning, after we caught and released a particularly feisty bass, Jake turned to me with a grin. "Never think how crazy this all is. A $500 ticket turned into a war, and now you're practically the mayor of this lake." I shrugged. I didn't ask for the fight, but once it started, I wasn't backing down. "You think Carter regrets it?" I smiled. "Every day she drives past the lake and sees that sign." "Yeah, I think she does." Speaking of the sign, I did eventually take it down. Not because I gave in, but because I didn't need it anymore. I replaced it with a wooden carving Jake made for me, a clean, simple plaque. "Walker Lake, private property access by respect, no threats." No bold red letters, just the truth. The community respected the lake not because they feared punishment, but because they understood what it stood for. It wasn't just water and fish and docks. It was a lesson, a reminder, that power doesn't give you the right to control people, that ownership means nothing without responsibility, and that the quiet ones, the ones who mind their business and just want to live in peace, are often the ones you should be most careful not to provoke. It's funny how life turns. I bought a house for peace, got dragged into a neighborhood war, and ended up with more than I ever expected. Not just a lake, not just respect, but freedom. The kind you can feel in your bones when the world goes quiet and the water reflects the sky like glass. Some evenings, I'd walk the trail alone, past the reeds and tall grass, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. Kids laughed in the distance. A father taught his daughter to skip stones. And somewhere, maybe in a different part of the neighborhood, people were sitting around their tables, still telling the story. "Remember that guy who bought the lake after the HOA fined him?" Yeah, that was me, and in the end I didn't need Revenge, I just needed to remind them. I don't answer to a clipboard, I answer to peace in this lake. It answers to me. Asterisk, if you enjoyed this powerful story of justice and revenge, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more jaw-dropping real-life dramas every week.